Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation beside the virtual fireside. We're here to talk about the ILO Global Business and Disability Network's new self-assessment tool. I'm Susan Scott Parker, the strategic advisor to the ILO network, and my colleagues are the famous Jürgen Menze from the ILO Global Business Disability Network and Neil Milliken. Are you famous because you're from ASDOS or because you're the new chair of the ILO Global Business Disability Network?
I'll take my fame
whichever way. So before we talk a bit about the self-assessment tool, I'd just like to ask Jürgen to put it in context for us. Tell us a bit about the ILO Global Business Disability Network and why you felt the time had come to produce, if you like, this new benchmarking tool.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. The ILO Global Business and Disability Network has been around for some 13 years, and from the very beginning, the idea and the mission of the network has been to bring multinational companies together to exchange among themselves best practices on the inclusion of persons with disabilities with a focus on employment, sharing good practices, supporting each other on their journey. We currently have 36 multinational enterprises in this global network, including, of course, Atos, represented by Neil here. Atos also being the chair of the network this year, next year. We also work with more than 35 national business and disability networks, which are country-level platforms of companies working on disability inclusion and some non-business associate members. So the whole idea is to promote the employment of persons with disabilities in the private for-profit sector, especially also in developing countries. And when companies join the Global Business and Disability Network, they sign a charter with 10 basic disability inclusion principles. Many years ago, we created already a self-assessment tool aligned with these 10 principles of the charter. But we felt that the previous version of the self-assessment tool was simply a bit outdated, maybe, not ambitious enough. And at the same time, we saw more benchmarking tools coming up, which we, from the ILO and the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, wouldn't always endorse. So we felt the time was ripe to revise the self-assessment tool, make it more ambitious, and make it even more relevant than the previous tool.
And so we started out with probably 12 months worth of consultations, looking at existing benchmarking tools, looking at efforts around the world to encourage companies to define and deliver best practice. And of course, as Jürgen explained, not only was the tool out of date, but private sector business leaders who are being asked to improve their performance were getting very confused by all the conflicting messages. And so many of the existing tools or benchmarks or indexes, whatever they were called, were grounded in local legal frameworks or in assumptions that were very grounded in a certain way of looking at the world if you're in America or you're in Venezuela or wherever. And so what we tried to do was to look at the universal principles that shape the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the universal human rights principles and other labor rights that are enshrined in the ILO's range of labor market conventions, and say, could we find a way to develop a tool that would enable any national business leader to, we think in 2 hours, in consultation with leaders across the company from technology and procurement and property and customer care and of course HR, to get a sense of where they stand against these universal principles. So the tool as it stands now has 47 questions, divided into 4 sections, because another reason we did this is there's always been confusion in so many of the instruments that the private sector are asked to use between what is required if you're going to deliver equal opportunities, treating people equally, recruiting people on a basis of equal, and what was culture change, and what was to do with customers, and of course, what was to do with corporate responsible citizenship, if you like, in the sense that we see more and more businesses now investing in their communities in ways which help to create job markets that, because they enable disabled people to get the skills employers are looking for, work to the benefit of both business and disabled job seekers. So we've got the 47 questions into these 4 domains, and we're confident that it will enable the national business leaders to see where they stand, take stock of where they need to make progress. They can then share that information with companies locally, should they choose to do so, because of course this is a confidential tool, and perhaps through the business disability networks that Jürgen mentioned, as a collective, spot where they're all coming short. None of us have got it right on property, so perhaps we develop a tool that enables our members in Kenya or wherever to actually get a more consistent approach to creating the accessible built environment that is win-win for everyone. There's another aim here, of course, which is absolutely crucial, which is that multinationals should be able to use it to ask, say, 50 of the countries in which they operate to do it locally, and then it will, in effect, tell the national business leaders where the gaps are, what they need from head office if they're actually going to be able to drive consistent, fair, and sensible treatment of people with disabilities worldwide. So before I say anything further about the actual tool, I wanted to ask you, Neil, thinking of how head office works in so many of the companies in the membership of the GBDN, what do you think is going to be the appeal? Why do you think global companies will start to use this?
So I think the appeal is that it is only 47 questions and 2 hours worth of consultation, because finding 2 hours, even 2 hours, which seems like not a lot, in the diaries of extremely busy individuals is actually quite challenging. And I think that having that top-level view enables them to have a conversation amongst themselves, because it's through them actually asking themselves the questions that they really realise, because you can send reports. My email inbox is full of unread things. By actually asking the leaders to ask the questions of themselves, well, how are we doing on this topic or that topic, they are required to think about it more than if they were just reading about the report from someone else or in a meeting where someone else was telling them about it. The participation is important. I also think that it's only part of the puzzle, but it's a really useful part of the puzzle, because as an organisation that's got fairly complex and well-developed programs, we want to drill down deeper and we want to have really good data. But it's a pointer, and we can use that, and we can also, as the chair of the GBDN, we want to make sure that the organisations that are members, it's certainly my ambition to drive the organisations that are members to take more action. And that means that we need to support the representatives of those companies at the GBDN to have the framework to enable them to get the support that they need to make change within their organisations. So to deliver the most important thing, the fundamental mission of ILO, which is decent work. And that's decent work for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I want to come back to what you were saying about needing to dive deeper. We're not pretending for a moment that these 47 questions, yes, no, that's the answer. But what we did do was to say, it doesn't matter so much in a funny way. If you've got a policy regarding the built environment or a policy regarding accessible tech, what really matters is that you've got a named senior executive whose job it is to figure out what best practice looks like for him or her in technology, say, so that they should then dig down after they've got their assessment and figure out what the IAAP and other standard-setting bodies have done with this, what the property should look like. We recommend they work to the ISO standard for the built environment, because local building codes are always inadequate when it comes to what a business really needs to deliver in that domain. And so what I'd like to see here is that you've got a named senior executive on the ground in Nigeria whose job it is to improve the accessibility of their built environment. They start to do their homework, and they then report back to head office in Brussels or New York to say, what guidance, what standards are we supposed to be working to? And then, as happened with GSK, their head of global property decided what we need is a global corporate standard that lifts us into best practice above any local building codes, which, as I say, are always inadequate. And so GSK then sends out across their entire operation in more than 100 countries, the kind of practical guidance, a corporate standard on the built environment, which enables their property people to work towards consistency with the approval of head office. But head office has sent down something that facilitates that movement. But what I'm really trying to get at here is we're not pretending that those 47 questions are the answer, but they give an indication to someone who's paying attention of where further work, further detail is required. And I think for me, I'd like to stress two particular strengths. What we see with existing indexes, if you like, or benchmarks, or whatever they might be called, is that it's not clear what is actually required if you're going to treat people with disabilities fairly, equally, versus what's nice to have and helpful, for example, having an ERG, an employee resource group for people with disabilities, always very helpful. So we've made a very clear distinction between the basics, we call it the fundamentals, which is how you make the adjustments, how you've got people responsible for being barrier-free for groups and adapting for individuals, which is how you treat disabled people equally. And then we move into the kind of things you can do and should do in terms of culture change, which we know are really important. Always learning directly from people with disabilities, whether they're colleagues or customers or community stakeholders, absolutely essential. The second thing we did that I think is quite different, and certainly was a first for the ILO, is we added questions about your approach to being barrier-free and welcoming customers with disabilities. I think this has been an area where those involved in economic empowerment have missed a trick in the past. One, it captures the attention of some people in a business to talk about customers who might regard anything to do with disability as naturally belonging to a junior diversity manager. This starts to position this in the context of business priorities. But also what we find is when you start to remove the obstacles that prevent disabled people from spending their money with you, you're starting to make it easier on the employment front. The premises in the retailers are easier for employees and for the customers. The online stuff starts to work better for everyone because your IT people are starting to focus on what accessibility really means. And I mean, years ago we saw the story of a company that had trained more than 20,000 frontline people in their stores to welcome disabled customers, including deaf customers, and they started to get all kinds of really good job seekers who were deaf applying for jobs because the deaf community was getting the message that if you welcome me as a customer, you might even hire me. So you get quite a virtual circle there. And I think I'd like to add to that before we finish. We also saw the need for organizations of persons with disabilities with an interest in influencing business, or the NGOs that get funding to help people with disabilities into employment, to get a consistent view of what is reasonable to expect from a company, because often they've got little experience of the reality of working inside a business. And so we see this as building the business confidence of the disability sector as well as building the disability confidence of the business sector. So we would encourage anyone who is working with a company, helping them to improve their disability performance, to use this tool so that both sides of the table get a better understanding of what is realistic, what is required, and what is really helpful when you're trying to shift cultures.